Welcome to Occultae Veritatis podcast. I'm Ood Gallifrey, and in studio... Sorry, I fucked that up.
Go fuck yourself.
Let me do it.
No, you did.
Yes.
Warning, this podcast contains violence, sexuality, gore, and other horrible and disturbing things. Listener discretion is advised. Also, the hosts of this venture are ignorant dipshits, so please do not take anything they say as fact, and enjoy the show.
Now, are you sitting comfortably? Good. Then we'll begin.
Today we had 15 homicides and 63 violent crimes, as if that's the way it's supposed to be.
It is our basic human right to be fuck-up.
A second plane now has crashed into the other tower of the World Trade Center.
Putting chemicals in the water that turn the friggin' frogs gay.
The defendant shall be incarcerated for the rest of her natural life with no possibility of parole.
You are not machines. You are not cattle. You are men.
We were somewhere around Barstow, on the edge of the desert, when the drugs began to take hold.
Occultae Veritatis. Hello and welcome to Occultae Veritatis podcast. I am Sage Murray, and joining me is... You?
Oh, me?
Yeah, you.
Say your name.
Oh, me?
Fuck, say your... Fuck.
Ood Gallifrey.
And Richard
Next.
Higley.
And joining us...
Arthur Dallas.
And Lady Mercury.
That was very fucking painful.
I know.
All right,
I'm sorry. I couldn't. I wanted to bug you. I wanted everybody to start off
again?
mad.
Like, God.
No, it was kind of funny.
We should just leave it the way it is.
Yeah,
I think they'll appreciate it.
It was kind of hilariously awkward. All right. So today I kind of was lazy and didn't do an episode. So I'm going to read an essay I wrote on the intersectional analysis of depictions of Indigenous people in media. But first, we need some poison.
So, what's your poison?
So what's your poison?
So what's your poison?
So what's my poison?
All right, so I am drinking some card Bordeaux, and I'm almost done this glass because we took so fucking long getting set up. It's 10 out of 10.
I was at the pharmacy, and at the pharmacy they sell individual Twinkies. So I figured I needed poison for tonight's episode, so I have a Twinkie here, and I can like ASMR the opening of a Twinkie.
Do it.
It smells like processed pastry sort of thing. It is small. It is sad. It is perhaps the perfect embodiment of the pandemic and being under quarantine and social distancing.
That's kind of beautiful. That was really cool.
The best part was being able to see your face while you said all of that and looking at legitimately sad.
I am legitimately sad. I have taken a bite of the Twinkie. I will give it a 5 out of 10 because it is very sweet and almost too sweet, but not sweet enough to wash away the pain of day after day of self-quarantine.
Fair. I've got to open up my box of wine and get the last delicious dredges of wine out of this bladder. Just give me one moment.
Some ASMR bladder draining.
That sounds just
you need
really
to hold
weird.
Okay, when they put water in ASMR, I always almost fall asleep, and then right when I'm about to pass out, I have to go to the bathroom. It's so frustrating.
All right, here we go. Draining bladder ASMR. Sorry, I've been drinking since noon. I've been drunk for a good 6 hours until now.
See, I'm just having a nice Earl Grey tea gin made in Saskatchewan.
That sounds amazing.
Oh, is it good?
It's really good. If you like Earl Grey tea and gin.
I do.
All right. Are we ready for the rest of the episode?
Yeah. I am ready.
Or the beginning, I guess?
Get real.
All right. So, here we go.
Being Indigenous, we have such a rich culture, and it can be overwhelming to people that look at us and they don't know really how to place us. And then we end up getting pushed into almost becoming like a relic in a museum where they don't know what to do with us other than, you know, we get pushed into the stereotype that we need a feather in our hair, you know, buckskins, being on horses and stuff. But I think, you know, by educating people on who we really are, we are breaking down the long history of stereotypes that we have, you know, endured for a very long time. Because, you know, today we are doctors, we are lawyers, we are baristas at your Starbucks, and we are, you know, we take on all these different roles within our communities. So, you know, why not start casting us in those roles? That, you know, and, you know, I've been very fortunate enough in my career to be cast in roles that are, you know, not, you know, ethnic specific. And I'm very blessed for that. And, you know, I continue to seek, you know, directors and writers that are willing to take the chance to cast me in those roles. But I think by educating people and having that conversation, just like what we're doing here now, will really help change the long history of.
Well, something else I want to bring forth too. I mean, we've always been stoic, and we've always been stereotypical. We don't feel, we don't express, and we don't have humor. And now they are casting us in comedies, which really we are, you know, not that we're funny, but we do have a sense of humor. Where for so many years, I mean, for so many decades, no one really looked at Indian people as humorous. It was always the stoicness that you were always cast as. So I think we've come a long way there. And we are getting cast in comedies now, and we are showing the world about, you know, our humor. And we do have it, and we're pretty funny. I agree.
I'd also add, just as a quick sort of like, you know, not trivia, but fun facts about Indians. We have a really unique and quirky relationship to this nation and the way we came up. I did some work with the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian, and they have a new exhibit called The Americans, which if anyone's out in DC, take an afternoon and go through it, because it's terrific. But just to kind of look at the way we evolved, that put us in this kind of like weird position that I think it crystallized in the way Hollywood portrayed us. For, you know, the initial years of the colonies and stuff, there were, you know, at times things were friendly, but things got heated, and, you know, there was a lot of fighting and enmity. Then when the third colonies became independent and pulled away from Europe, they needed something to distinguish themselves, their own identity, and they took on the identity of American Indians, because we are not European. We are this native land. And so suddenly white people were all Indians. It was not a mistake that the Boston Tea Party dressed up as Indians when they went and trashed the British stuff. And so that was where the kind of noble savage myth came in. But a very odd thing happened, because suddenly then everyone, I think, felt to be American, you could actually own a little piece of Native American. And that's why everyone, you know, comes up to us and says they had, you know, somewhere a great-great-great-grandparent who was Cherokee or something, and that's like, okay. Yes, yeah. And it's kind of weird if you think about it. There's nobody else, there's no other group that is on jars of butter, or, you know, they're a motorcycle and a warship. And like, that's just like, yeah, we're all over the place. And that's just but when it comes to our stories and our culture, that's an odd thing, because, you know, we want to be included. We are a part of this tapestry of America, but there's a fine balance between realizing that we are kind of like part of what makes us, but giving the respect and telling things accurately and with respect and good intent. And so that's the past. Now we're here, and I think it's a much more enlightened time. But I'm not bringing that up to kind of rue the past or anything, but just to put it into context, that's the uphill battle that I think we all face, and also something I think that like saddles all of us, because we're all in this together. So
first disclaimer, I'm not Indigenous. I am the whitest of the white. This is coming from a settler student, and seeing as it was a essay on Indigenous representation in media, and we are media, and I'm white, I asked Lady Mercury to come and be my Indigenous representation. And also because I love her and I missed her and I wanted to, hang out with her.
Oh, this is also nice.
It was a little bit selfish.
It's really white of you.
And I know, I'm sorry. I'm very Ukrainian. Media have had a long history of inaccurate, racist, and harmful portrayals of Indigenous people in film and television. So throughout this podcast, I will attempt to outline both classic and contemporary examples of these portrayals, as well as provide analysis regarding why they are so prevalent and the impacts associated with them. In addition, I will attempt to discuss how contemporary filmmakers are both challenging and changing the negative tropes, such as the, in quotations, native princess trope and the strong and silent trope that have been so prevalent in the media for so long. Ever since the silent film era, certain specific tropes, stereotypes, and generalizations have been employed by filmmakers when depicting Indigenous people on the big screen. Many of these tropes are incredibly derogatory, damaging, and racist. As with many media portrayals of people of color, Indigenous folks are often painted with one large homogenized brush, despite being a varied and diverse group of people. The article that I cited outlines how minority groups' lack of representation or negative representation can cause them to start to believe these things themselves, explaining that the limited representations associated with minority groups in the media, in terms of both quantity and quality, are likely to convey to group members that they do not belong and cannot be successful in a number of achievement-related fields, for example, education, business, where minority groups are scarcely, if ever, seen in the media.
So just to clarify that, are you saying there that not only is there not enough representation in media, but the representation that does happen is skewed enough to, damage the perceptions of groups of people?
Yes. Sorry, that was a very wordy way of saying it.
I mean, that's what I got from it too, so
yeah,
I think it's good.
This can be potentially incredibly problematic because more often than not, this social representations being depicted by the media are harmful, racist, or outdated. So one trope that is heavily used in film is the native princess trope.
It's all right. I'm not gonna hurt you. Here, let me help you out of there.
Medakwe naturat.
You don't understand a word I'm saying, do you?
Pocahontas.
What? What did you say?
My name is Pocahontas.
I'm John Smith.
In this depiction, we see Indigenous women being portrayed as beautiful, demure, virginal, and subservient. A native princess is often rescued from the hands of a savage and violent man by the white protagonist. So a popular example of this trope is Tiger Lily in Disney's 1953 film Peter Pan. Yeah, so she's a young, beautiful princess who, in stark contrast to her other incredibly offensively depicted Indigenous counterparts, wants to help the very white Peter Pan, who is depicted as the savior.
Those kind of things just seem to hold the implication that, thank God these white guys arrived to save these, nubile young native people from, their own parents and ancestors.
Exactly.
You can see the messages being pushed in that structure that their society is inherently violent and that they should be rescued from it. You can see what's being pushed in that.
Yeah. Well, exactly. And then I have
that's the whole savage thing, right? That's the whole thing. They have that song in that film that's it's brutal.
Yes, it is brutal. Oh god, it's bad. Okay, well, I'm going to talk about Pocahontas next. So another popular example. Yeah. Another popular example is Pocahontas in the animated Disney film. So markedly different from the other violent, teeth-gnashing depictions of Indigenous people in the movie, Pocahontas sees the good in the colonizer John Smith and provides him with her magical, beautiful wisdom. So John Smith is seen as a savior, taking Pocahontas away from this uncivilized world and allowing her to experience the right and dignified way to live. So the real story of Pocahontas is far less romantic. While John Smith really did visit and develop relationships with the Powhatan people, it's not as rosy and straightforward as Disney made it out to be. So I read this book called The True Story of Pocahontas, The Other Side of History, which is by Dr. Linwood Littlebear Costello and Angela L. Daniel Silverstar. It's about the British colonizers. They basically used the Powhatan people to help strengthen their position in America. Once Pocahontas came of age, she was kidnapped in an effort to buy the British time to bring over even more men and ships. The colonists claimed that holding Pocahontas ensured the peace between the two people. However, the colonists were actually buying more time. They were trying to keep Wahunesaka, that's the name of the group that she was a part of, from retaliating in response to the colonists driving out and killing the people and destroying the villages and confiscating our crops and farmland all the way up to the falls of the Powhatan River. So the English colonists were rapidly bringing in supplies of guns, farming equipment, cattle, other livestock, and immigrants to occupy the land. They were positioning themselves to be strong enough to defend themselves from any major attacks. So, the treatment of the indigenous people was absolutely abhorrent, but in the Disney version of the story, it is all a beautiful story of love and reconciliation.
Serious whitewashing there, though.
Oh, hell yeah. So much whitewashing.
Look at
I think we should take a moment just to recognize her as the first murdered and missing indigenous person from the North Americas.
Yeah.
It's a really rank story, right? And there's like a whole bunch of stuff happening currently with that, and I just think it's important to recognize that position of it because it's not stopped since, right?
No, well, they stole her and named her Rebecca, and then she died of like syphilis, didn't she?
I can't remember what she died from, but I know she did end up passing away.
And she died really young.
Yeah, super young.
Yeah, of an ailment she never would, that she only got because she went away with the colonizers.
Yeah,
they do?
Wikipedia says it's either pneumonia, smallpox, or tuberculosis, or being poisoned, but she was 21 when she died.
Yeah, just a baby.
So
that's definitely.
And her husband at the time, a guy called John Rolfe, who I can only assume was old because who names their kid John Rolfe?
That's John Smith, yeah.
He said, "All must die, but 'tis enough that her child liveth." As she died.
And like, let's take the media portrayal on its face. Like, the true story is horrifying, like, on its face. But even if you look at, like, the whitewashed Disney version where Pocahontas falls in love with John Smith, I mean, getting in a relationship with somebody at the end of a gun is not a balanced relationship. Like,
no, especially when she was like 15
and like
at the
he
time.
like, who knows, like, even in the Disney version, like, I would question that relationship because there's these settlers coming in who pose a threat, and is Pocahontas getting with John Smith just to protect herself? Is it not out of love and affection but her own self-preservation that she does this? Like, it's an abusive relationship even if you go with the Disney standard.
Yeah. Yeah.
So growing up as a young indigenous kid, this was like the first movie I'd ever really seen that represented anybody that was Native American or indigenous. At that time period, it was Native American that you're saying. But this was like my first representation of it, and it was really great when I was a child. As I grew up and I watched it again, I was like, holy fuck, this is a horrific movie. And probably the reason why I love Toxic White Men so much.
Oh no. So, okay, another common trope surrounding indigenous folks in the media is the strong and silent trope.
Don't you even know how to be a real Indian? I guess not. Oh shit, no wonder, jeez. I guess I'll have to teach you then, ain't it? First of all, quit grinning like an idiot. Indians ain't supposed to smile like that. Get stoic. No, like this. You gotta look mean or people won't respect you. White people will run all over you if you don't look mean. You gotta look like a warrior. You gotta look like you just came back from killing a buffalo.
But our tribe never hunted buffalo. We were fishermen.
What? You wanna look like you just came back from catching a fish? This ain't Dances with Salmon, you know. Thomas, you gotta look like a warrior. There. That's better.
So during the classic film era of the 1930s, Westerns were very popular. And one of the most famous indigenous characters was Tonto, which literally means stupid in Spanish. He was the strong. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It literally means like stupid or like simple in Spanish. And
I mean, that would make sense if they would call him that, though, because he's silent, right? So, like, they're trying to portray someone who doesn't speak as much as someone who's an idiot, which is not really true.
But he was, like, the mostly silent sidekick of the Lone Ranger.
Right.
So he talks like a child, using terms like, get him up, scout, and kimosabe, and is depicted as completely inferior to the Lone Ranger, except for his speed, agility, strength, and, of course, magical person of color wisdom. He's wise and strong, but that's pretty much it. He has no actual personality apart from being the Lone Ranger's faithful sidekick.
That trope goes across a whole bunch of media too, you know, mystical brown and black people. Just like, it's the Deus Ex Machina of so many like cheap, shitty movies.
Yes, there's always a mystical person of color.
Well, like, I don't know, in
sci-fi. That's because we're magic.
Well, no one's denying that.
In sci-fi, for example, and Star Trek Voyager, the first officer is, I guess, an indigenous representation, and you know it's the whole thing. You know, he's got like a tribal tattoo on his face, and he's got the mystical spirit guides, and you know that sort of thing. And I mean, it was. For, I suppose, what you would consider to be a progressive show, it was still a very regressive, presentation of indigenous cultures.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Definitely. Okay, so these were and still are some of the only acceptable positive features that most indigenous characters seem to be permitted to display in Hollywood. The show did not take into account that indigenous folks are distinct individuals who come from a wide and varied area of backgrounds. Slap a buckskin jacket on a darker skinned guy with 2 braids, and that's every indigenous person ever. So these old movies rely on a homogenized Indian. He is usually male, wears buckskin beads, feathers, and has a pinto pony, and is savage, uncaring, and brutal. While it's a shallow image, we don't see families carrying a sense of community, spirituality, or day-to-day life.
These partners are, like, if you're engrossed in a culture, you learn the language fairly quickly. And, like, these shows depict these, like, indigenous partners of the white protagonists, like, never learning English. Like, they always stay at, like, the super childlike stage of English, as if they never learn or advance, you know?
Well, it's also implying that the white person's language is far superior to anything that the indigenous person could ever possibly come up with, which is bullshit.
Absolutely, 100%. Especially in indigenous languages, they're so complex, and there's so many like small nuances, and it's really not comparable to English, right? Like English, a lot of us speak it because of colonization.
And you know, talking about representation too, I mean, I don't want to say that any of these were good, but at very least the first Tonto, like he was a First Nations guy, and most of them were until Johnny fucking Depp decided that he got to be the Tonto in the last.
Oh no, there were lots, and like most of the early, in air quotes, indigenous actors were white dudes with brown face paint with a feather on the back of their head.
Oh yeah,
to help keep their wig on.
Yeah,
some good old brown face.
I think most famously, you know, the crying indigenous dude from the old, like, Don't Litter commercials, where a piece of litter is dropped on the highway and like a single tear rolls down his cheek? It was an Italian dude.
He was definitely
it was
white.
It was a dude from Italy. It wasn't indigenous at all.
Some people have a deep, abiding respect for the natural beauty that was once this country. And some people don't. people start pollution, people can stop it.
Let's fast forward to Twilight New Moon, where you had a whole pack of werewolves that were all supposed to be indigenous people. And were they?
Were they not?
Some of, I believe one or two of the actors was, but most of them were Latina, which it is, that's indigenous for sure, to the Americas. However, when you're shooting something that's in a located area of a continent, like, I think you should be pulling indigenous people from that area where there are a lot of young actors who are indigenous in that. Speaking
as a twihard myself, like that movie was shot in the Pacific Northwest, and there's so many indigenous tribes there. It's not like they had a lack of people.
Oh my goodness, there's so many different ones with so many, like, such varied cultures, right? Like, it's actually really disappointing that they did that when that movie was made, because they could have made it so much more authentic, and actually given young indigenous children a view into saying, like, oh, that's something that I can do. Like, I can be an actor that actually will have work.
100%. And also the fact is, like, besides the main big bill actors, they didn't have much budget for other big bill actors. So, like, a lot of people's careers were made of that movie because they were, like, amateurs or people who have never been in movie before that were plucked out of the area to act. So it's not like they were only hiring, like, official actors. They were hiring amateurs all over the place. They had no excuse.
Yeah.
What do you think about in Outlander? They had, like, it took place in the newest season on Netflix that I just watched. It takes place in America, but they couldn't get American indigenous actors, so it's like all Canadians and like all like famous Canadians that you would recognize if you saw them. They could
like
only
Canadian
get Canadian
actors.
Yeah,
like
Canadian
indigenous actors,
but they couldn't get American indigenous actors for some reason. I don't know why.
Well, we're all people, like, we're migrating people, right? So, like, we probably shouldn't even be settled in Saskatchewan, to be honest. Like, indigenous people wouldn't do that. We knew better. We'd pack our shit up and move on. So when it comes to Canada and the US, the line is a little bit more blurred, because they really could have, if that border didn't exist, been migrant people who would have, like, you know, like, traveled and
kept on going.
Exactly. And, like, possibly a lot more tribes would have been more blended because of traveling. Because, like, we don't have any record of that, right? Because, like, we just have the Bible and a couple of charters.
That's right.
Just records of where people were when white dudes showed up and said, "Who are you? You're this, you're
right?"
Here, right? Yeah, because that's always one of the questions: is how would a First Nations person live in Saskatchewan in the wintertime? It's like they fucking didn't. They went south, like we should.
Yeah.
They fucked off to somewhere that wasn't minus 50.
Well, when I was in Louisiana, we were doing a tour, and the tour guide was like, "Oh yeah, like, here's this bay. It floods every year. The indigenous people he said the native people from here, they actually never settled here, but when settlers came, they saw them here, and then they put up permanent houses, and then all the indigenous people would fuck off once they knew that the season would come, right? Because that's what we did."
Real quick, going back to the person who was called the Crying Indian, which is the one that we referenced. His name was Iron Eyes Cody, but he was born Espera Oscar de Corte. And it wasn't until his 20th film role that he had a name in any film. His first film roles were Indian After Firewater, War Eagle, and Indian. His 20th one, though, he got a name Santana, which is, you know, an actual name.
Wow.
Yeah,
Indian.
Yep.
Wow.
All right, so back to Tonto. This depiction of Tonto on the show is racist. The filmmakers have basically compiled a stack of indigenous stereotypes, added pinto ponies and buckskin jackets, and given him a lily white do-gooder as a sidekick. Tonto's basically only purpose on the show was to prop up the Lone Ranger and to be kind of funny in a pitiable way that white folks would feel comfortable chuckling.
He was there to make the Lone Ranger look good.
Yeah, and to like add a little bit of like mystical magical person of color wisdom to the show. So
not an actual character, just a prop.
Yes, absolutely. He was literally just used as a prop. I also looked at a study that was in an article called Native American Stereotypes, TV Portrayals, and Personal Contact. Most of the white college students interviewed were of the opinion that Indigenous people were inferior to their white counterparts. This was found to be largely due to the fact that the students surveyed had very limited interactions with actual Indigenous people and were drawing upon their experiences with characters in Hollywood films. So according to the contact theory that was from a guy named Gordon Allport in 1954, the more time a person spends with members of an ethnic group that differs from their own, the more positive their opinions of that group are. The opposite is also true. With little or no contact with actual Indigenous folks, many people rely solely on the plethora of negative stereotypes perpetuated by media. Negative depictions of Indigenous folks began as early, as I said, as the silent film area, with films being created by white people for white people. With such a long and storied history of harmful portrayals, it sadly kind of makes sense that people with no actual contact with real Indigenous people would have negative opinions about them, just because they've never met them. They don't think that they're real people. They think that they're magical idiots.
I will honestly say that when I was living in the United States, I really struggled. Living in Canada, being Indigenous is one thing, because you're just, like, not cared about and, like, pushed to the side. In the United States, they really, honestly, to God, believe that we no longer do not exist. Anytime I would meet someone, they would be like, oh, you're Latina. And I'd be like, I'm not Latina. Like, I'm this, and I'm from here. And they would, like, look at me so quizzically and be like, what? Like, there's still Indians in Canada? And I'd be like, we don't use that word. But they really thought, like, Pocahontas was, like, the first and the last, and they all died. Because, like, it's so much more, like, swept under the rug there, whereas, like, Canada has, like, quote-unquote reconciliation that they're trying to do, so there's a recognized amount of Indigenous people here.
Well,
America's very black versus white, right? Well, black versus white versus Hispanic.
Like, in the States, they just, like, straight up killed a lot of their Indigenous people, just, like, killed them.
Yeah.
Whereas in Canada, they basically tortured them and tried to turn them into, like, good little white brown people, which is
kill the Indian, save the man.
Yeah, even more nefarious, I think.
I mean, except for some of the ones on the coast, because they totally got genocided entirely.
Oh yeah, lots of them got genocide. Well, they tried to
genocide. People are completely wiped out because of John Campbell. I wrote a report on that in grade 5 and almost got expelled from school because I wrote it from an Indigenous standpoint, and my teacher, Miss Rogers, did not like that.
Yeah.
What? Fuck Miss Rogers.
It was actually a really funny story because I wrote it. My dad took me to the library and I was like, I have to write a report on John Campbell. And my dad took me to the library. He was like, here is a book on Beothuk people. And I was like, what? Who are these people? And I read all of it and I read what happened and all of that shit. And I put it into a report. It was a it's probably the report that I worked the hardest on in my entire school career.
Mm-hmm.
And then a couple of days later, I got brought into the school with my dad. And she was like, what is this? And my dad was like, this is what really happened. Like, what's wrong with it? And she was like, this is the material I wanted her to source from. This is a report that she has to write. And my dad was like, fuck that. Like, no, she wrote this. She did her own research. She worked way harder than every other student in this class. Mm-hmm. And then she was like, okay, well, if she doesn't rewrite it, she's suspended. And then that's it, right? And so my dad was like, oh, fuck, like, you have to write another one. He was like, I want her original report. I think he kept it for a really long time, actually, because he thought it was a really hilarious story. But I did end up having to write a very white version of that.
That's nonsense. I hate that. That makes me really mad.
Canada, man.
And Canada. Like, people don't, like, I know people are, like, they obviously assume that, like, colonizers didn't think much of the native people, but when you read some of the journals and some of the things that these colonizer leaders, like the generals and, like, the ship captains that led, like, the colonization movement, like, the way they talk about indigenous people, like, they talk to them as if, like, they're writing a guidebook on how to deal with, like, you know, when you step on this land, make sure to take care of the poison ivy and all that. Like, they talked about indigenous people the same way they talked about like a harmful plant species or like an animal that might give them some trouble. And this is how you deal with this in order to access the land and resources and blah, blah, blah.
Well, I mean, that's really how they saw everyone that they colonized, right? If you weren't part of where they're from, you don't fucking matter.
Exactly.
That happened in Africa. That
all
happened
over,
everywhere.
all over the Caribbean. Yeah. Like, really, like, we're going to do, at some point, we're going to do a big mega episode on colonization. And fuck, that's going to be like...
Well, it's going to be a fucking long... Many Indigenous filmmakers are rising to the fore in the filmmaking industry and are reclaiming the narratives of their community. So a great example of this is the First Nations First Features Showcase. So global Indigenous media are a powerful arena of cultural production through which Indigenous filmmakers and activists take up Western media technologies to document Indigenous cultural traditions, counter dominant media misrepresentations of Indigenous people, and articulate Indigenous cultural futures. It is a practice that simultaneously alters the visual landscape of mainstream media by representing Indigenous faces, histories, and experiences on screen, while serving a crucial social role off-screen to provide a practice through which new forms of Indigenous solidarity, identity, and community are created. There's this group of Indigenous filmmakers that basically got together and had this like super rad film festival.
Oh, well, I was going to say that, I mean, even locally here, we have an Indigenous theater group, Gordon Tatusis Theater, named after the Indigenous actor Gordon Tatusis, who I believe was on North of 60, I believe was the kind of the big break for him, but I could be wrong on that. But they actually like write and produce and present like actual like Indigenous cultural theater, and it's a bunch of different things. Like, for example, they've got a presentation or had one where it's called the Unplugging, and it's about two Indigenous women in a post-apocalyptic world. So it's kind of like the same sort of media that we would consume as settlers, but it's like it features an Indigenous perspective with Indigenous actors written by Indigenous people, and it kind of, I don't know, it brings their stories, to a much, I guess, broader audience. Yeah.
I think that's really important because, like, colonization has happened, right? So, like, we talk about decolonization and all of that, but is it really honestly possible at this point? Probably not. Deprogramming and making sure that we are going back to our original teachings and incorporating that into our regular life now is absolutely super important. And when you take something and you indigenize it into a way that makes it unstereotyped from these mass other stories that we've seen that are very blanket statement and wrong, it gives people a little bit more knowledge into seeing that we're fucking people and it's okay that we're different, right? Like, it's really important for everyone to be different culturally, because if not, it just goes into like the blanket like one world thing, and that's terrifying and gross.
Exactly. It's not accurate.
Harmful, shitty, horrible.
A lot of Indigenous filmmakers, in addition to actors, are also getting a lot of support out of the National Film Board. So, I don't know, either they have a lot of films on their website, nfb.ca, where they help fund, different creations, some Indigenous, some not. And, and a lot of, documentary makers and producers and stuff can get their work funded and get their stories out there as well. Like, I just checked the website and the first thing that comes up says Waneskawan as a film, and it talks, I guess it's a film about incarcerated men and, how they get treated, at this healing center, and I don't know. It's neat. There's a lot of different Indigenous perspective on that website, and I would encourage people to check it out if they want to see more Indigenous storytelling.
Mm-hmm. Also, one of my most favorite books is called "Take Me to Your Chief," and it's a bunch of short sci-fi stories told from an Indigenous perspective, and it's fucking amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right. So, okay. In addition to advocating for Indian actors, the IAA functioned as a support group. If, in quotations, Indian actors had trouble finding work, the IAA provided subsistence funds, which it raised through membership dues, powwows, and performances for local clubs and organizations. These groups ensured that their voices are being heard and that they were no longer being relegated to a harmful racial stereotype or a goofy sidekick. Social networks are being strengthened, specific points of view being presented, and Indigenous representation in film and television being changed for the better.
Getting a whole bunch of voices together so they can't be ignored.
Well, there's lots of amazing, exactly. There's lots of amazing Indigenous actors, like why not use them? So in conclusion, Indigenous folks have been poorly represented in the media since there was media. Harmful tropes such as the native princess trope or the strong and silent trope are some of the only representations of indigeneity that many people ever experience. Because of this, many people have a poor opinion of Indigenous people simply because the only exposure they have is from the harmful portrayals in the media. Thankfully, there are groups of Indigenous filmmakers and activists that are tirelessly working to turn these negative stereotypes on their heads and to help ensure that Indigenous folks are fairly portrayed in the media. The end.
One small thing that I want to say.
Not the end.
This thing.
Go ahead.
Is so like I said, I date toxic white men, right? Like, I don't know what's wrong with me. But this one guy that I was dating, his mother, when she asked me the question, like, where are you from? And I was like, Canada, duh, like, you know that. And she was like, no, where are your people from? And I was like, Treaty 6 and Treaty 8. And she was like, I don't know what that means. And I was like, well, I'm Indigenous. And she's like, I don't know what that means. And I was like, I'm Native American. And she was like, oh, I do know what that means. My great-great-grandmother was a Cherokee princess.
Ah, yes. And 164th Cherokee, the old adage.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And it's like a really frustrating thing as an Indigenous person to like hear someone say that for clout when like we obviously hung out a lot and like I would be like, oh, this is a cultural teaching, and she would like roll her eyes like I'm not traditional, and I'd be like, I know, because you're not Indigenous. Like fast forward to like a lot of times later, she like brought it up all the time and talked about it, and I just don't want to fight with anybody, so I told her, I was like, I don't really believe that, like let me see you get an ancestry DNA test and then we can like really talk about it, because she was wanting to like show me like me to show her how to do sacred things, and I was like, I don't really think so. Get your little DNA test and then let me know. Fast forward, she ended up getting it.
Yeah.
Were you talking to
That's what I was going to say. Pulling a Warren.
I mean, probably cousins. So she did the DNA test and it came back and she was like very humbled when she was talking to me, and she was like, I need to tell you something. And I was like, what? And she was like, I'm actually not Native. And I was like, I knew that.
No fucking shit.
And I was like, I just want to let you know, like, you actually owe me an apology. Like, it's really harmful and toxic of you to say that you're these things and try to get clout about it and not actually be from that
Lady
background.
Mercury, I hope I'm not putting you on the spot, but like I'm sure you are better able to spot like harmful stereotypes in media than we are, because we're not as like aware of it. Like what kind of things do you spot that really just like stick in your craw?
Oh man, like they're generally dirty, they're generally pathetic. Anybody who's of color, period, is generally stigmatized right away. They're degraded a lot. They have like a hero moment, and then all of a sudden now we see them with new eyes and they're a hero or some shit, right? And that's so fucking wrong, because like how I see white people is completely different than that, right? Like I want it's kind of the same, I guess, because like in movies they're always great. Like you can have like an adolescent boy who's figuring himself out, making a lot of mistakes, and he's just a fucking shitty person, and then he comes into his own and it's a beautiful magical story. Then you can have an Indigenous person or any other person of color, and they're like, they could be having the same struggles, but instead of being seen as somebody who's like just kind of figuring it out and like doing his best, he's a fucking loser or a criminal or a hoodlum or some bullshit, right? And like then maybe way later he'll have like a very small redeeming moment that's like, oh no, he is a real person. Yeah. And I think that's incredibly shitty. It's really racist.
Or like, oh, he's a good one. He's one of the good,
Yeah. It's like when I was growing up, I would fight and be like, I'm Indigenous because I'm really light skinned, right? So like, unless it's fucking August, you really can't tell if you're seeing me with plain old white eyes.
How about the fact that the only thing that a First Nations or an Indigenous actor can play is an Indigenous person? Does that make sense? Like,
yeah, we don't have any other interests beyond that. Like, I don't know how to do anything else.
Yeah, you can't have a main character who is, incidentally an Indigenous person. They have to be an Indigenous person for front and foremost.
Like, what about an Indigenous badass lawyer, right? Like, I know a few of them, and they're fucking killer because they have to be way more ruthless than anybody else who is a settler. They just have to be, but in a really diplomatic, straight-edge way, right? So, like, why not put them as a fucking amazing badass doing their shit into that role? Because they can't, because nobody's going to recognize it because everything has been so seriously stereotyped.
I'd watch the absolute shit out of a crime procedural featuring an Indigenous lawyer who just doesn't take any shit.
That hero narrative you were talking about exactly kind of matches up with like Indigenous lawyers having to be so much more ruthless. It's like the society expects them to prove themselves before they're going to be taken seriously,
Well, that's how it is, right? Because like, it's like even if you look at Indigenous, we talked about Indigenous men in media, but like if you look at Indigenous women in media, they're always seen as like hard-headed or angry or like consistently annoyed or some shit, and then soft sometimes and vulnerable sometimes. And that's really shitty because it really do be like that, Like, I am very loud and I am very proud, but I don't want to have to fight like that. And I don't want to see other women being portrayed like that. Like, that's a really shitty place to put somebody. It's like the angry black woman stereotype, right? Like, I have so many friends in the States who, instead of like really talking about how they want to say something, they have to really dumb it down and pacify it in order to be heard in a way where they're not just a reactive, angry black woman. And that's fucking disgusting.
But also it seems like most roles for Indigenous people are like sidekick or like side roles or best friend roles, just to be like a prop for the white main character.
Look at Slipknot.
Absolutely.
Look at Slipknot from Suicide Squad.
Who played that guy?
Oh boy.
Let's see how they did
DC. You gotta have done one goddamn thing right with that movie. Come on, DC.
Come on.
Almost. He was.
Don't make me hate Batman.
Is that
Adam Beach?
Okay.
Adam Beach.
Okay, he's. Okay. Okay, Suicide Squad officially did one thing right as a movie. God. Okay, put that up on the chart. Suicide Squad, one thing right. Good job. Oh wait, they killed him in the first 10 seconds. Sorry, Suicide Squad, sorry. You get your point taken away.
You almost had a point.
I mean, let's just give them a second, because you remember when like the horror movie thing was happening and the black guy got killed in the first second every single time? At least we're getting into movies now, right? Like, there's somebody that's in the door. Like, I'm just trying to find some representation.
I mean, at least the actor was Indigenous.
I don't know. At least it was Adam Beach.
It's a sad silver lining. It shouldn't have
taken
this
it generally
long.
is sad.
I mean,
like, a lot of it's really
I guess to go out on a good note, I would suggest not only supporting media that portrays, Indigenous people, like black people, like anything like positively, but also support independent media, supports the media around your area of that. Like we just found out that Saskatoon has a little Indigenous film society, and I'm wondering what I can do to maybe like support them. Maybe I want to rent one of their movies. Who knows?
Saskatoon has like a really lit Indigenous scene happening. I've been meeting a lot of people over the last while that are all part of it, and I'm really excited to really be here and find this out. It's really, really cool to be a part of.
Having been a part of like obviously I'm a white settler student, but being a part of like the Indigenous Studies program at the U of S, and also the Women's and Gender Studies program at the U of S, I've met lots of super like badass, amazing people that are doing.
That's the other thing you can do.
Things.
Especially during the quarantine here, there's a lot of universities and a lot of colleges that are offering free online courses. And some online universities already have online courses available. So if you can find an Indigenous studies classes taught by an Indigenous person, I would suggest maybe auditing that. You might learn a thing or two. Keep your mind open. You might learn some things about what your ancestors may have done,
or about what the first people in the country that your ancestors have colonized may have done.
Yeah, it's really shitty that I will have to learn a lot of my past from things like that. I think it's incredibly horrific.
Oh, that's definitely going to be part of the colonization episode because
we kind of
really upset to think about that.
It is really upsetting. I really don't it's a whole thing because people would be like, "Oh, what's this ceremony?" And I'm like, my whole family was whitewashed.
Like people talk about Canada
exactly.
like it's this socialist, progressive paradise, but we tortured, brainwashed, and whitewashed the Indigenous people that lived here to the point where a lot of them, a lot of their cultures are erased. They don't remember things about their cultures anymore. They don't remember languages that, their entire families used to speak. It's terrible.
Well, that's the kill the Indian, save the man thing, right? That all goes back to that and how incredibly violent that was. Yes, in the United States, they absolutely slaughtered and just killed a lot of people, but in Canada, they severed a culture, right? And when you are taken out of your element and you're forced for something else upon, you lose something. When you can't pass on your traditions or you don't have answers for questions when you're an elder and a young person is asking you, that kills you. I've had numerous conversations with my grandmother about why she did not teach me my language, and it was because she thought that I would be unsafe in this country if I were to speak my native language because of what she and her family and our other ancestors and family went through, right? How sad is that?
It's awful. Think about how many opportunities you have. We have a Ukrainian school in Saskatoon. There are a zillion Ukrainian dance schools. There are a zillion there's Ukrainian choirs. You can do whatever you want if you're Ukrainian.
I mean, you can do whatever you want if you're white, right? That's the whole worldview. Unfortunately.
Yep, exactly. Yep. Gross. Okay. Well, I am done my episode. So, for Occultae Veritatis podcast, I am Zoey Perry, along with
and in studio with
and joining us in studio,
Arthur Tallis
and Lady Mercury.
Okay, thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
I love you. Good night.
Love you.
Playing us out this episode, once again dipping from the early 1920s, this is the Varsity 8 with their song, Crazy Words, Crazy Tune. Enjoy, and see you in the after show.
Crazy words, crazy tune, crazy tune, crazy words. Every song, oh, do-do-do-do-do-do. His ukulele daily, how he'll drop, ba-ba-ba, stamping and stamping. Then he'll holler, black bottom, crazy words, crazy tune. He'll be driving his crazy tune with his ball, do-do-do-do-do-do.
reading an Instagram message from Brooke. And yes, if you follow us on Instagram at OV Podcast, or you follow us on Twitter at Occultae, and if you send us a message there, we'll read it on the show just the same. Or you can send it through the regular old passage, which is at ovfeedback@gmail.com. But today from Brooke. Hi, my name is Brooke, and I'm a massive fan all the way from Australia. I've recently found your podcast, and I fell in love with you guys in the first episode. That's good to hear. I'm still insecure about our first episodes, but it's good that they still seem to work for some people. I'm currently listening to episode 22, all about ECT and how it's depicted in the movies and shows, but actually can help. Not saying I want it myself, but I feel like you guys explained it to me in a good way where I understand why they do it. And I just love the way you guys understand about and talk about mental illness, being someone with depression and anxiety myself. You guys make me feel normal. The way you speak of it isn't a weakness, but just another part of who I am. And yet that's part of the stigma we're trying to break here. Like I'm a mentally ill person myself, and even I sometimes have trouble getting past the stigma of mental illness. But none of us asked for it. None of us, planned for it. And it shouldn't be treated as anything else than just any other physical difference. It's a part of life for many people, and it should be destigmatized so we as a society can serve mentally ill people the best way possible, which is giving them everything they need. And if we treat them like some dangerous outsiders that are going to snap at any second, that's not going to serve them in the betterment of society. So yeah, I'm glad that's coming across. I love your podcast and the way you guys mix the right amount of fact and fun, and I'm so excited to get to your most recent ones. Only 99 episodes to go. Also, Leon, I hope I spelled that right. You did. I always look forward to your rating of What's Your Poison, as it's always interesting. When I listen to your podcast, I always finish happy and have a giggle during the episode. I love your chemistry, and you guys are my favorite podcast to listen to. Sorry this is so long. Oh no. Feed my ego as much as you want. You guys, anybody that wants to pour their hearts out into our social media or email boxes, I will drink up every word. My ego is a ever-thirsty monster. I love your chemistry, and you guys are my favorite podcast to listen to. I love listening to you, so you keep it going, you strong, beautiful individuals. P.S. The only thing I would change is I wish your episodes were longer, and I would love to hear an episode on witchcraft or voodoo. Well, you're in luck. Case 102 actually features modern-day witchcraft, and we have two witches on the podcast to explain kind of their belief system and how they interpret some of the words they use in their belief system. Also, I'm not sure if you're going to listen to the most recent episodes and the old episodes in order, but you're going to come to a point where Leon takes a break from the podcast. Because, we're all people with normal lives that have pressures put upon us, and sometimes we can't have the podcast as a priority. You're going to come to a point where Leon leaves for a bit, but it's funny that I'm reading this email right here and now, because the very next episode coming back is Leon's official return to the podcast, quote-unquote. Not as a special guest, not as a previously recorded appearance, but him back as a host. And he's talking about something mouth-watering. You'll find out what it is. Until next week, you guys take it easy. Remember, in stressful times, it's still good to find places you can laugh and smile. That's as important as vitamins and minerals. Have a good night.